Welcome. Welcome back again. Welcome to another exciting episode of Carving the Divine TV. My name is Yujiro Seki. I'm a director, writer, and the producer of the documentary Carving the Divine. Carving the Divine is about Buddhist sculptors of Japan, and I'm ready to present it for the first time in the world. But before I do so, I thought it would be a great idea to introduce basic concept of Buddhism and the history of Buddhism so that when you guys finally watch my documentary, you guys can watch at the maximum value. So today, we're going to be talking about something very special. We're going to be talking about the racism and the Buddhism. It's such a big idea. And I just want to let you know, we're not going to do a show just because we want to make ourselves feel good. We're not going to do a show like, I'm not racist, you're not racist, we are not racist, and they're racist. They should feel shame of themselves. We're not going to do a show like that. We're going to do an authentic, real conversation. And I brought somebody who can do this. And, we can talk about something deep. So I would love to introduce to you Bishop of Nichiren Shu, North American Order, Reverend Muyoke Caine-Barrett. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful.
To our conversation.
Great. So yes, I know you are very famous in your community, but just in case, for the people who don't know anything about you, please introduce yourself.
I am the resident priest of Myokei Temple in Houston, Texas. And I have been the resident priest here since 2007. I have been practicing Buddhism in the Nichiren tradition for over 50 years. And I also do prison work, bringing Buddhism to people behind bars, as well as working with veterans who return, to help them return from war, no matter what war it was. There's a lot of difficulty for people transitioning back to normal life. So I work with them. And I'm also a very strong advocate against racism. And I've been doing that for over 30 years.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for a great introduction. Yes, I would like to tell you my story a little bit. When I was in Japan, when I was a young kid, I didn't think that much of a racism because I was in majority, and the majority of the people in Japan were Japanese and still are Japanese. And I know, Japanese people discriminate against people from different cultures and all this, different race and different ethnicity. But it was no big deal for me because it was not affecting me. But when I went to the United States and became a minority, I felt racism for the first time in my life. Well, I'm not gonna get into what kind of experiences that I had, but the point is that when you are in the oppressing side, it is sometimes hard to see you're oppressing other people or you're discriminating other people. So with that being said, I would love to ask you, what is racism exactly? And why should we care about it?
I think first we have to look at prejudice and discrimination, because discrimination is what we do when we recognize and understand the differences between two different things or many different things. And prejudice is when we tend to discriminate against people because of the groups they're in, their gender, their ethnicity, or whatever, but it's usually based on stereotypes. Racism is a combination of prejudice plus the power to do something about it. So I can be prejudiced against anybody because maybe I believe stereotypes. But if I don't have the power to prevent them from living or getting a job or making the kind of money they need to or where they live, then my prejudice doesn't really do the kind of harm that racism does. And when we talk about racism, we talk about individual racism, systemic racism, or institutional racism, unaware racism, internalized racism, all of which are a function of the power of prejudice against those who are discriminated against. And most people don't want to be called racist because our idea of racism is looking at the Ku Klux Klan, or people who burn crosses in your front yards, or as some of the present day, the militias, you know, the white supremacists, all of those kinds of groups that discriminate against all kinds of minorities. And most people don't want to be associated with that. Most people are simply guilty of having prejudice based on stereotypes. But it's something that impacts all of us. When we talk about internalized racism, it's the kind of racism where those who are discriminated against tend to adapt themselves to the standards of the dominant culture. For example, in Black communities, you'll see that hair is a big issue. You know, so many people straighten their hair because the standard of what looks good is straight hair, not kinky, curly hair. Even though that's changing, but you'll see a lot of that hatred, self-hatred, because the standards of what is good that has been presented is based on a fictionalized ideal. And we should care about it because as Buddhists, especially, if we live in a condition where some of the people are not free from suffering, then really, in reality, none of us are free from suffering. Because the whole thing for us as Buddhists to understand is that we are not separate from each other. What impacts you impacts me, and vice versa. That as the teachings that we follow talks about non-duality, we are not separate, just in the same way we are not separate from Earth or the animals and plants and the environment. We are all inseparable. So we have to take care of each other. It's not about being selfish.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, yeah, I agree. I think very few people want to be called racist, but you
Yes,
know, we don't even know what this means. You know, that's the problem. So you know, you told me about the prejudice and the racism and the differences between those words. I think many people are not even aware of that. Mm.
right. Well, because racism in the dictionary, when you read it, says one thing, but it doesn't break down the fact that it requires the power to do something with your prejudice. So we have systems of racism in this country that have been there for a long time. And it's been a constant struggle for those people who have been marginalized to try and gain the equality that is guaranteed by our governing documents.
Yes, yes. I love the fact that you mentioned about the history. So, you know, we want to know a little bit about the history because without understanding history, I think we can just talk about theory. And we want to understand a little bit more about the racism. Please tell us.
Well, if you look at the history of this country, the first enslaved people, there were about 20 or so, landed in Virginia and brought over by a Dutchman. And these were in, I think, about 1619. And even though these enslaved Africans had been part of French, Portuguese, British, Spain, all of their travels since the 16th century, it was the first time they had come to the Americas. And from that point, up until the 1800s, about 12.5 million enslaved Africans were kidnapped from Africa and brought to the United States. And only about 10 million of those survived that 2-month journey. So it's been going on for quite a while. And it was at this point during the 1600s that slavery became a legal institution in this country. And there were statutes that were implemented to prevent enslaved people from marrying anybody that wasn't a slave. So you couldn't have mixed marriages back then. And then you had laws that said the status of the mother determined the status of the child. So if the woman was enslaved when her child was born, her child was automatically a slave. And it was the first time during the 1600s that slaves were given the status of slaves for their entire lives. And there were also at that time indentured servants. And this, our history in the 1700s was when the Declaration of Independence and the American War against Britain and France, all of these different wars that we had. And we had groups that were formed to abolish slavery, but it never really took hold. And the Declaration of Independence did not give enslaved people their rights as humans. And then there were fugitive acts that if a slave escaped, he had to be returned. And anybody who tried to hide them or interfere with their return to their masters could be prosecuted. Then that continued on to the 1800s, even though early on the slave trade was banned, but it still continued in the Americas. But there were changes that occurred. That some states like Missouri came into the Union of the States as a slave state, so they could have slaves. Whereas maybe like Maine came in as a free state and didn't have slaves. So you had all these different states with different kinds of rules and regulations regarding slave trade. And then about 1860, Lincoln was elected president, and the Southern states seceded from the Union, and the Civil War began in the 1860s. And it showed that the census showed at that time that the Black population was about 4,500,000 individuals. And only about 500,000 of those were free. The rest of them, 4 million, were still enslaved at the time of the war. And so the war was thought to be about states' rights, but it was states' rights surrounding slavery because they didn't want to give up their slaves. So 1863, we had the Emancipation Proclamation that said if the North or the Union won the war, then the slaves would be free. And then 1865, we saw the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which denounced slavery, prohibited slavery in the United States. Then followed by the 14th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. And during this time in Reconstruction, Black people were able to gain some property and, with their freedom, also develop themselves. But in the meantime, you had the Ku Klux Klan develop. And so many different areas where there was prosperity within these formerly enslaved communities, poorer white people would destroy these communities. And you've heard of places like Rosewood and Tulsa, where they destroyed Black communities, Black Wall Street and churches and all kinds of businesses. And there was never anything done about that. So every time a community would rise and develop, it was torn down. So then we get to the 1900s, and we have what is known as the Jim Crow era, when you have separate drinking fountains, separate places to eat. Like a Black person couldn't go into a store and try on clothes. You had to go to a Black store. And so, that was the time of the desegregation of the military after the World War I. And in World War II, many, many soldiers, Black soldiers fought in the war, only to return and not be able to take advantage of things like the veterans' bills to buy homes or have the same equality, because there was a lot of trouble when these soldiers came back feeling free because they had fought for freedom in Europe and in Japan at the time. And they came back to the United States and still didn't have their freedom. So, and then we move on to the 60s, where we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act that were passed, but still there were laws that the voting rights in particular swept away a lot of the laws that prevented people from voting, like a poll tax or literacy test, and but so much of that now has been set aside because of the Supreme Court decision in 2013, which said that since racism was no longer a problem, they didn't have to worry about new voter laws because the states had already resolved those. And what the result was reintroduction of harsher requirements to vote even. About 33 million Americans have been removed from voting rolls, largely in minority communities that are likely to vote Democratic. And it's still going on. Redlining, where you were not able to buy a house in a certain neighborhood, or you were restricted to certain areas. And the wealth of Black Americans today is about 1/10 of the wealth of white Americans. I think the one poll showed 171,000 a year for white families, compared to 17,000 a year for Black families. So there's still a huge level of inequality. It's something that has never really been adequately addressed. I think it was Mitch McConnell who said that reparations for Black people was Obama being elected president. And the conversations about reparations for the hundreds of years of enslavement and labor that led to the construction of this country that need to be repaid, which is probably why a lot of the anti-Black sentiment has grown stronger, because people feel I had nothing to do with that. It was a long time ago. It doesn't impact people today. But as usual, if you don't experience it, then you don't know what's happening to people who do. And so that's the great divide that continues to this day, unfortunately.
I understand. So you talked specifically about the Black people, but it's racism only for Black people?
No, and particularly in this country, I mean, I could go on for hours about this because we have, the Anti-Chinese Act, and then acts against Japanese people, the internment after the war or before the war. Then we also have against Latinos, anyone who is not white. And it's been like that for a long time. I mean, the history is full of cases where people tried to challenge the constitutionality of discrimination only to have it upheld by the courts. And, the only group in America, I think, that ever received any kind of reparations were the Japanese, because everything was taken from the Japanese when they were interned in the camps. And so they received some reparations, but it wasn't a whole bunch, because I think the case was made, especially since the majority that were put in the camps were American citizens to begin with, and just only incarcerated because they were Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to apologize for that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now I want to deep into something more personal. So
Okay.
can you tell us a little bit about your personal story about the racism, so that we can actually identify with the racism better? We talk about the big picture, but now it's the time to talk about the small picture.
Yes. So I think my father was in the military, and Um, I was not aware, it's so much hindsight. There were laws against people who married Black people. And so when I was growing up and we came to America for the first time, because I was born in Japan, um, my father drove all night. We never stopped. I never understood why we couldn't just stop and get a hotel room or, but it was an adventure. And we had to use a pot for the bathroom in the car because we couldn't really stop anywhere, especially at night. There were a lot of places that if you were Black and found outside after the sun was down, your life was in danger. So I learned that many years later. And because he was in the military, we lived largely on military bases. So in that sense, we were not so discriminated against because everybody was military, or if we lived overseas, everybody was a foreigner. So the first time I ever experienced actual racism was when I was 10 years old, after we came back from Germany, because we had lived in Germany for about 4 years. So it's pretty nice in Germany. When we came back to Texas, that's where he was assigned. I went to a school that was outside of the military. And so it's a regular public school. And one of my teachers got very angry with me and called me the N-word. And I didn't know what it meant because I'd never heard it before. But I knew it was bad because, when a grown-up reacts very negatively to you as a child, you always take it personally, like, what did I do? What happened? So I never told my parents what happened. I just remembered, that it was bad. And then I learned later. It's something that stayed with me for a long time. The other piece of it was that there were 7 other Lindas in my class. And so when I was Linda number 8, she refused to call me by my name and used my middle name. So in the way she said my middle name was really awful. So it was something that I refused to use for most of my life afterwards. After that, I had a friend who was blind. And when she found out that I was Black, she stopped being my friend. So the only friend I remember having was a Chinese girl, as we were both the only 2 Asians, because my mother is Japanese, the only 2 Asians in the school. And so, that was my friend. And that was my first experience. And luckily, I didn't have to deal with too much because then from after we stayed there for a while, we moved to Okinawa. And so Okinawa was quite nice, actually, but it was always coming back to the United States. And especially when we lived outside of the military base, that I could experience the differences. During the 60s, and I know my mother dealt with a lot of racism because as a Japanese, she was always subjected to people telling her, you bombed Pearl Harbor, why are you here? Go back to where you came from. And when I was in, middle school to high school is when I started to hear more of that myself. And people would call my mother a whore and say that she married my father just to come to the United States. So there was a lot of that. And it's always been the case that I wasn't ever fully accepted in the Black community because I was never Black enough, especially because I didn't have a Black mother. And that went on for years and years. But I also did not find acceptance in the Japanese community, except for within Buddhism. And in the white community, it was always tentative. You're okay because you're not like those Black people, So there was never any full acceptance anywhere. So I could tell you the journey of my life has been about my identity, and it has changed over the years. I remember we used to call ourselves Afronese or Jafricans, trying to figure out what we could call ourselves as being mixed people. And here in the United States, they were not familiar with mixed Asians, because mixed people were always seen to be Black and white, but never Black and Asian or Black and Latino. And because of social media today, more and more of us are finding each other and talking about our common experiences. So some of us even today call ourselves doubles because we have double the culture, or we have triples because we're Black and Japanese and American, because we have 3 different cultures that we're dealing with.
Mm, mm. Wonderful, but it sounds like you know anybody could discriminate against each other. You said that Black people are even discriminating against you. So
Yes. Well, it's something we were all taught. The whole idea of racism is something we learned even inadvertently from our parents, from watching television. Because I remember the first time seeing Black people on television, because for a long time you didn't see that. And, you had these TV shows about Black people that were not quite like real Black people's lives, but at least they were on television, the Sanford and Sons and um, the Jeffersons and, Archie Bunker, all of those back in my day. That what I see on television today is extraordinary, because we're seeing a whole bunch of different people. And now they're even having mixed couples on television, which didn't used to happen. So when you see that and you're growing up that way, that the standards of beauty and intelligence and success are only white people, then after a while, the caricatures of your people that you see on television start to become part of your personal story. I remember the cartoons I watched as a child, and the type of hair that Black people have, or the big lips, or when they showed Japanese in cartoons, they had buck teeth and glasses, So these stereotypical images are fed to people and they don't question them because it seems to be okay, because that's what you're watching on television. That's what you see in the movies. It's so different now because the movies are becoming more realistic and opening up people to the idea that it doesn't matter who you are, we all share the same kind of suffering, all of us. None of us can escape birth, aging, sickness, or death. That we know is Buddhist, absolutely. And so because of that, we have to understand that our conditions of suffering are the same and we're not separate. But it's difficult to unlearn it because most of us are not aware that we have it.
You know what? That brings up to the next point. So yes, so that's the reason why you chose the Buddhist path. So I was just curious. So there are so many paths, especially in the United States. Buddhist path is not the most popular path. So why did you choose to be a Buddhist instead of being affiliated with other religion?
Well, in the military, you go to a Protestant church or a Catholic church or a Jewish synagogue, depending on who the officer is, who is a chaplain. So it just depends on what teachings you get. And so I did not grow up with ties to a Black church. So I never experienced that when I was young. And when I would go to church as a youngster, they would tell me things and I'd say, well, how did that happen? And why did that happen? I had all these questions. And they would always tell me that I just had to believe, and then my answers would come. In the meantime, I had these images of a life of a nun or Jesus that I saw in MGM movies, So I thought Audrey Hepburn was a nun. She had a wonderful life. She was passionate. She was helpful. And then Jesus was beautiful. So I wanted to follow that life, but I could never get the type of answers to the questions I had. And then when I was about 12, my mother's friend invited her to go to a Buddhist meeting. And my mother didn't want to go because she's very much at that time anti-religion. But she let me go to keep her friend's daughter company. But she said to me before I left, don't join anything. So that's like waving a red flag in front of a bull, of course. But when I got to the meeting, the people were chanting the Odaimoku, and I smelled the incense, and I felt at home. So I decided I was going to join because I liked that. I didn't care what anybody had to say, the experiences they told me and why they practiced Buddhism. I just felt comfortable with that. And I learned some 40 years later that I think it's because of this, that my aunt, my mother's family was a Nichiren family in Japan. And my aunt used to take care of me. And she is a devout practitioner. So I feel as if when I was 1 and 2 years old, this is what I heard, the chanting and the smell of the incense, which brought me home.
Wonderful, wonderful. So is Buddhism diverse in this day and age?
I think it's always been diverse, but we just didn't know, because there was a separation between the ethnic communities, the Asian Buddhist communities and the Western Buddhist communities. The Asian Buddhist communities have been in this country since the early 19th century, and nobody really knew about that, right? And then I think in 1900, maybe 1904 or something like that, temples were established in Hawaii and in the west coast of the United States about 1912, that the Asian community started having religious groups develop. And then it wasn't until later that Westerners started bringing Theravadan Buddhism into the West from the different countries they traveled to. I think about the time of the Beat generation. So for the most part, the Western idea of Buddhism has been very white because it was more intellectual, academic, if you will, and didn't rely so much on the same kind of tradition and ritual that were found in ethnic communities. So there was a divide there. And you see it in the sense that when the Tibetans came over, everybody fell in love with the Tibetans, and because they were Tibetans, they were given special status because of, what they were going through and the fact that people romanticized their lives and their heroism in operating against the Chinese. But they also thought, I noticed a lot of attachment to these different monks, that people, elevated the monks to guru status. So you do have some of that. But you also have Asian people who grew up Buddhist, but also trying to explore it more academically without necessarily feeling welcomed in these white congregations because, the tendency to just eliminate tradition and ritual has occurred in a great many communities. And so there hasn't been much meeting ground between the two. I think that's changing now. As more and more people realized how unwelcome these white Buddhist communities were. I don't think they knew. And it was very hard for people to come into a community that didn't understand their experiences, because that's why people go to religion in the first place, is to find an ease to their suffering a way to get out of their suffering. And if you cannot talk to your teachers or fellow Sangha members about what you're experiencing and have understanding, then it's very difficult to practice Buddhism.
Mm. So does a racist exist in Buddhist community?
Yes, yes, because it exists in all of us, you know, and it's this unaware racism that we were taught by people we loved and trusted. So we never questioned it. And for all of us across the board, it's very difficult to meet new people, new circumstances with new eyes or innocent eyes. You know, we always bring with us our experiences and the negativities that we carried. So it's hard to look at someone and say, that's a new person. I need to find out what he's like, or, you know, his experience. Who is he? Instead, we're in our minds going through, oh, he looks like that guy I ran into last week, you know, or maybe he's Latino and I had a bad experience with a Latino or a Black man or a white man. And when I see that person, everything comes up for me, even if I'm not aware. I'm triggered perhaps, you know, so it takes a lot of work on an individual level to eliminate that kind of racism. And it's especially difficult when it happens in groups that are predominantly one or the other, so that there's no one calling you out about the fact that you've just done something that might be racist, you know, a microaggression, you know, that you'll say to someone, oh, you're such a pretty girl for a Black girl, you know, or even though you're Japanese, you are so articulate, you know, and those are kind of microaggressions that is like, wow, okay, you know. So we have to be able in community to speak to each other with truth and with compassion, be very conscientious about how we treat each other. And it takes a lot of work. And so again, people don't want to be thought of as racist, but we have to remember we grew up in a culture that is inherently racist. And it's hard to get away from it.
Very well. Well, when we talk about the racism, I often hear the term cultural appropriation. So what is cultural appropriation?
It's the taking of something from another culture to use it for your own purposes without really understanding what's behind it, what, you know, what supports it, what it's truly all about. And one of the principal ways we see it today, and I know a lot of people won't like this, is like mindfulness has, in some respects, has been taken out of Buddhism and left the religious part of it behind. It has become a technique, you know, or part of therapy without really attributing it or honoring where it came from. It's like, you see it a lot with, for example, yoga. One of the most serious cultural appropriations, I would say, was the time I saw an advertisement for Christian yoga. And when I saw that, I thought, do they not understand that yoga also has its own religious foundation? And now all of a sudden it's made Christian without understanding that, you know, there is a religion and faith tradition behind what happens in yoga. But they're just using it as an exercise and throwing Christianity onto it to make it their own. And when we talk about, there's cultural appreciation that you can, you know, learn about a culture, understand its traditions and meanings, and express your appreciation for it. And even like some people do shodo and tea ceremony, you know, and really honor the tradition of tea ceremony because they love the Japanese culture behind it, you know, or they're not trying to make it American, or, you know, they're just really appreciating the beauty and the simplicity of the entire thing and all of the energy and practice that goes into it. When you find people who are really into like flower arranging or Japanese calligraphy, because they really appreciate the beauty of it. They're not trying to make it something it is not, or for their own profit, or, you know, this is something I developed, even though it comes from another culture. And it's a difficult situation, particularly, I think, within the Black community, because there have been times that Black women in particular have been chastised for hair, for example, wearing braids or locks, and they were thought to be not professional. But when white women wear the same braids, they're thought to be quite beautiful, or, you know, the different way that the bodies are expressed, you know, fuller lips, bigger hips, were always thought to be unattractive, but now they're more attractive. So everybody's trying to get fuller lips and bigger hips, you know, even to the point of having surgical procedures to make that happen, when, as they were shown originally, were not appreciated and thought to be very negative traits. It's a very confusing issue, I think, across the board. You mostly see it in things like the names of football teams, you know, the Indians or the Chiefs, that are now finally beginning to change.
I often hear in the Buddhist community, in Buddhism, everybody is equal, and
Yes.
you know, racism doesn't exist in Buddhism. Is that really true? Is the race is no issue in Buddhist community?
It's an issue everywhere.
Okay.
For as long as people do not root out their own unaware racism. You know, we all have bought into different stereotypes, you know. I mean, I never thought, for example, that white people would understand the separation that children feel when they're separated from their friends because of skin color, because it happens to every child who has a white friend. Eventually that parent, the white parent, will, as they're getting older and more mature, that the time when they start going to dances together and things like that, that they start to separate their children from those of another race. I can remember when my own daughter was going to school and I was having a conversation with a white neighbor, and she says to me, well, you know, I couldn't send my daughter to that school because, you know, it's when they start falling in love and, you know, going on dates and everything. And who would she go out with at that school? You know, and I was kind of like, oh, okay, you know, because it was surprising that for me to hear that. But I understood finally that unaware racism. She wasn't trying to be a racist, but she never thought it appropriate for her daughter to date Black men. So she didn't want her to go to a school that was predominantly Black. She wanted to have a greater choice of who she could go out with. I met white people who had been raised by Black women when they were children. And so one of the greatest losses they experienced was the loss of that person who worked in their homes as a nanny or a maid and took care of them. But it was something they never talked about. And only as I got into doing more work in anti-racism did I hear some of these experiences. Because, you know, I always thought it only happened to Black people. And in the same way, all of us are constantly like peeling the onion to find out who we are. What triggers us? What stops us from interacting with certain individuals? And there have been times that I have found myself reacting in a negative way, and only to stop and say, wait a minute, okay, that's an old idea. Why are you experiencing that now? You know, to remind myself that the idea that I had came from somewhere outside and not from what I had actually experienced.
Wow. So I think nobody wants to be called racist. And
Right.
I mean, I think one of the things that I think it's difficult to nowadays is we have a tendency to blame everything on white people, and when white people react, like I didn't do it, and I'm no racist. I care about everybody's equality. Why are you blaming on me? So what we should do about this? It's very complicated.
Well, I've always been part of groups that have conversations about this, because there are questions that each side wants to ask the other, like, what was it like for you? Or, have you ever experienced this? And there's never been a place for most of us to sit down with a person of another race and have those kind of conversations. And I've been part of various groups over the years where we do sit down and talk to each other about how we feel about certain issues and, what's it like to be discriminated against, so that we develop some kind of understanding, so that we can understand that the experiences are things that we all share, maybe in different arenas. Every person who is gay can understand discrimination. Every person, every woman can understand it if they're willing to open their eyes to the fact that, discrimination occurs simply because she's a woman, or gay man or gay woman or lesbian or transgender. Everyone understands it from their own perspective. And the idea is to get these conversations happening so that we can see that our perspectives have a great deal in common. And what we all have to do is root out the ism that governs us, that keeps us from uniting together in a common, on common ground. When we have to work together as a Sangha. It's hard work, and it takes a lot of dedication, and constantly checking in with each other to say, anything happened for you lately, or what came up, any experiences, so that we help each other along, because we're all harmed by it. It's not a one of us in this country has not been harmed. And it doesn't matter our race or ethnicity, our age, we all carry the stain of racism. And the important thing for all of us to do is find a way to eliminate it, to unroot it, and to be able to see each other with the same kind of care and compassion that we would give, a puppy even, More people find it easier to just open their hearts to a puppy than another person.
Well, in that sense, I might upset somebody, but I'll ask you this question. So in some sense, we are all racist. Is that true?
Yeah, yeah. We can't help it. Every different culture has its own form of something like that. I think even Japan has changed, because I grew up thinking and learning that Japan would not welcome me because I was a foreigner and also half, and sometimes that was true. But in other times, I find greater acceptance. I feel much more comfortable because the issue of that kind of racism is not institutionalized. Nobody's going to say to me, I can't sleep at this hotel because I'm a foreigner or I'm a half. That doesn't happen in Japan. At least that hasn't been my experience. And I've never heard anybody say that. You could find places where you would not be accepted simply because of who you were, still in the United States. And people are trying to find other ways of getting around laws for equality and all of that. but you cannot legislate people's hearts. And some people want to hold on to their racist or discriminatory feelings against people who are different from them. And, you know, it's kind of like, that's the way I am and I'm not going to change it. But the majority of Americans, I think, want to see change, want to see a better union of the people that live in this country.
Wonderful. How can we accomplish that?
By continuing, you know. I think that's the purpose of faith and religion, to help us understand that we cannot discriminate. We cannot deny others the happiness that we're all seeking, the joy of life that we're all seeking. Even though I know some religions, all religions have separated people and turned against people. But the fundamental teachings of all religion are that about love and compassion and equality. And there really should be nothing that keeps us from seeking that everywhere. You know, and one of the ways we accomplish that a lot of times is through interfaith dialogue and meetings and getting to know each other and talking about our scriptures and our teachings to find a common ground. It's not always easy, you know, because religion can also be quite rigid. And for some folks, they're not going to welcome anybody that's different. It doesn't matter what the religious books say, they'll find a way around it. We live in interesting times. That's all I can say about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you so much for today. We had a very, very engaging conversation. So yeah, I would like to know more about you. Yeah, please tell us what's going on in your world and you know, how can we find more about your the temples and website and social medias and all this? Please tell us.
Well, we are currently online as a community. We have been offering our services online for years, but now it's primarily the only way we can get together at this time because of the COVID. And we're also not allowed to go to the prisons, so we're working on getting DVDs of services sent into them so they can enjoy the service even as we're out here. We are on Facebook as Myokei Temple, and I'm also on Facebook as Myokei Caine-Barrett. And our website is myoken-ji-usa.org. And so you can find us that way. We are still trying to work on other ways to expand our reach to different communities. It's slow going because not everyone has access. So we're working on finding out how we can use social media to expand. And one of the things we are doing that is really powerful is a monthly 24-hour Odaimoku chanting session that is global. And it starts.
What is Odaimoku again, quickly?
Is chanting Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which is the title Myoho Renge Kyo of the Lotus Sutra. So it's devotion to the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wonderful Dharma. And it is our primary practice in Nichiren Shu and I believe all of the Nichiren traditions. So we are chanting to heal the world on the full moon of the month, first full moon of the month. So the next one will be October 31st, Japan time. And it's 24-hour Odaimoku chanting on Facebook. So you can find that there. And it is quite lovely to observe, especially the different ways that people chant around the world.
Wonderful. So needless to say, so anybody from any race, any nations can join it, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. because that's what Buddhism is about. The Buddha said, I see all beings equally. There's not this one or that one to me. All are the same. And so most of us are trying to prove that every day.
Wow. Beautifully said. So yes, if you think this information is useful, make sure to subscribe my YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and like me on my Facebook, because that's how we do it in the 21st century. So thank you so much, Reverend Muyoke, for coming here and talk to about this very complex but important issue, racism and Buddhism.
Thank you for asking me. I enjoyed our conversation. Let's do it again.
Yes.